I think that it was eclipsed by performance values of the modern era. And, I'm not saying that that bore diameter, be it an 8mm, which is weird in itself, and we've never observed an 8mm in the U.S. really click.
All right, what is up, everybody? Got my good friend, Ryan Muckenhirn, across from me. You'll notice we're sitting down. I mean, we sit down a lot, but this is a cartridge talk, Ryan, which is generally a 10-minute talk, which is never a 10-minute talk, more often a 20-minute talk.
But we never sit.
Because this is a full-length cartridge talk. You've been wanting to... Still up for debate whether this will be some sort of series. We're going to make it a thing for today. I'm going to... What do they call it? I'm going to...
make a concession?
No, not make a concession. I'm going to humor you today.
Mark.
Ryan's had a concept in his head. He's like, I want to do this lead balloons cartridge series talking about cartridges that are lead balloons. And I will grant you, it's a clever play on words. Lead. We're talking cartridges and bullets. Even though for you, you're always, copper. Which I love copper projectiles too, so I'm not saying anything against them. Regardless. Some people say irregardless.
Which is ridiculous.
It's just regardless, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If my buddy Anderson is listening to this, he says irregardless, and I hammer him to the ground on it every time. Blaster, if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
It's just regardless.
People in Wisconsin also like to say, I need to de-thaw something. No, you just need to thaw it.
I see.
It just needs to thaw. Anyway, we're talking about a cartridge here today.
Hold on. Just hold on a minute, Mark. Just give me a hot second here. About 860 days ago, I got to check the numbers on that.
Approximately.
About 860, I pitched the idea for lead balloons, in which we highlight a cartridge that was commercially introduced, but from the commercial success standpoint, not a winner. Didn't float.
Mm-hmm.
Not because it's a bad cartridge, but it just never hooked up.
Sure.
Some of them, rotten tomatoes. Some of them, exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
A lead balloon.
Right. That will be interesting if we talk about a few of these in the future. Because like you said, some of them are just like, how you look at it, it's like, it's got everything, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you're like,
Yep.
And then some you're like, I get it.
You know what I forgot to do?
What?
I forgot to get a balloon and a string and some silver spray paint and paint a lead balloon.
No.
So imagine me holding a balloon that's not floating as if it was made of lead.
Yeah, not too long ago, we had a listener comment. I'm thinking of this now, so I don't recall the actual. If you're listening out there, you know who you are. They made the suggestion just not that long ago. They're like, "Hey, you guys should do cartridge talks on cartridges that never took off."
Yeah.
So then I took that comment, and then I was like, "Yeah, we should do that."
Then it got some teeth.
Yeah.
Because it was my idea, because it was a cool name. Mark's like, hate it, not doing it.
Nah, it validated your idea. I was like, no.
And 860 days is approximately when. It's been almost 3 years. Anyway, let's fire the weapon, Mark.
It's really not that different than a regular cartridge.
It's not. No,
it's the same thing.
It's just it's a fun twist.
We get lots of suggestions for cartridges.
We do.
And this is one of them, the one we're going to talk about today.
It is.
Hopefully we've either kept people in suspense long enough or they've already left. We don't know. We'll look at the numbers on this podcast after. I think it's been suggested by a couple people. I think it's been suggested by the same person a bunch of times. One that I have here, Robert Rink. Is that how you would?
I'm going to go with Rink, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
How about a 10-minute talk, which this isn't, on the 325 WSM, the 325 WSM, Ryan. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see about as many printouts as I've ever had. And we're talking about a cartridge here that did not take off at all.
No, not really.
Now, often when people suggest a cartridge, Ryan, it's because they love it.
Yep.
And Robert, he may well love this cartridge.
One of the last of his kind.
And I'm not saying that he shouldn't. But as many printouts as I have in front of me right now, I don't. Are you going to change my mind?
I don't know. I think it's worth mention. To quote Hunter S. Thompson, Too weird to live, too rare to die.
There you go. Now, hopefully, lots of caveats here. I'm giving lots of caveats.
Yeah.
I say that, I'm not into this thing. I don't like it. I don't care for it. I don't think it has a place. In the same breath, I could say, if this is the only rifle you had, you're good to go.
That would be a damn good one.
So,
Yep.
How can it be? I don't know. Let's talk a little history here, Ryan. Let's talk about the 325 WSM.
WSM.
The WSM.
The year was 2005.
Yes, it was.
Topping the rock and roll charts. Foo Fighters. Best of You.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Did you look this up?
I did. And I thought it was serendipitous that it was called Best of You. I don't think this is the best WSM, but
No.
it's a good WSM.
I think it might be the worst WSM.
Oh, no.
Okay, let's go. Keep going.
So we talked about this earlier. We're going to classify this as a medium bore. Now, if anybody's out there be like, that's not a medium bore. A medium bore starts at .366 or .375. All right. It's bigger than 30, smaller than 375. How about that?
There you go,
it's about
right?
the middle. We'll call it a medium. It is an 8 millimeter, which was a very perplexing choice.
Mm-hmm.
And over the past, decade or so, or a little bit longer than that, almost 2 decades. Wow. I've read why it was an 8 millimeter, not a 338, which would be like the conventional.
Well, so, and we can't talk about any cartridge without talking about the best cartridge, the 300 WSM, the 300 WSM, as they call it, as we call it. That was kind of that was the original WSM, right?
Mm.
The 300, right?
The best.
Introduced in 2000, I believe. So we're looking at 5 years later.
Yep.
And like you said, everybody thought the next progression was going to be
338.
338, right?
Yes.
But it sounds like they tried.
It does. And so I've read speculations on this as to why it wasn't. And okay, so the design intent of the WSM family was to duplicate or exceed the long Magnum version of it, right? And so aside from the 270 WSM, which maybe it was gunning for the 270 Weatherby, maybe that's what they were going for, it certainly surpasses what the 270 Winchester can do. That's kind of the other 270 long action.
Mm-hmm.
The 300 was gunning for the 300 Win Magnum, the full-length version.
Mm-hmm.
The 7 WSM was gunning for the 7 Rem Magnum. The 325 WSM was gunning for the 338 Win Mag. But it wasn't a 338. It was a 323 or an 8 millimeter.
Right.
I have heard that the reason that it was an 8 millimeter, not a 338, is because they couldn't get the performance numbers that they wanted using a 338 projectile for whatever reason.
Right. It came up short.
Yes. I have also heard...
Sorry, that just...
Get that boom tiss in there.
Yeah, right.
I've also heard that feeding
Mm-hmm.
was compromised.
Mm-hmm.
Just general reliability, consistent pressures. And maybe this all goes into we couldn't emulate or exceed the performance of the long version.
Right.
But it was curious. It was super weird. And at that point in time in my life, I'd have been like 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was weird that they went with an 8 millimeter over a 338. And I think that maybe my head was going to the hand loader at that point in time. Like, well, you've pretty much just hamstrung them because there's like a very small smattering of bullets available in the 8 millimeter diameter at that time. From like a really good projectile standpoint, there's certainly 8 millimeter bullets out there. 8 millimeter is not a new diameter by any stretch of the imagination.
It's not, but historically, and I'd say even today, although maybe more popular than when the 325 was introduced, still not very popular.
Flounders. You'd say it's a lead balloon.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it does do exactly what they wanted it to do, and it does it very well.
Which is?
Get to that 338 performance level in a smaller action, lighter gun, shorter barrel, more nimble, with potentially less recoil.
Okay.
It checks the boxes. I think its undoing might have been its unconventional bullet and then the limited scope of use for a cartridge of that ferocity, right? It's a big round from like a recoil standpoint.
Yeah, do you know how many foot-pounds it's generating?
3,770-ish. In fact, Mark, on those printouts, if you were to flip through a couple.
New printer's printing double-sided right now, which I guess is probably environmentally.
It's only set to Mark's printing preferences.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like
Here,
double-sided.
let's take a look here. All right.
Yeah, this is yours. I printed.
So
out
I'm
what
going
you
to
sent.
separate these. I went ahead and I compiled a couple of 33 caliber options, and then the 325 WSM. A few things. So we went ahead and we looked at, first and foremost, a bullet weight in a factory loaded option, muzzle velocity, muzzle energy, and then drop at 500 yards.
Okay.
Which is a long ways. So a 325 factory load. This is a Winchester. It's a Combined Technologies loading, so it's a 200 grain AccuBond.
Okay.
Great bullet.
Mm-hmm.
MV on the box, 2950. Muzzle energy, 3866. It's got some horsepowers.
Okay.
Okay. At 500 yards, with a 10 mile an hour full value wind, we require about 9.7 MOA with a 100 yard zero and about 4.1 MOA of windage correction in order to defeat that. That's a pretty remarkably flat shooting cartridge, especially for a big critter. The closest comparison in a factory loaded cartridge outside of the 338 Win Mag would be the 338 Ruger Compact Magnum. Also a cartridge not a lot of people hear about, but a brilliant cartridge nonetheless.
It is.
225 grain SST with a muzzle velocity of 2750, putting up 3,778 foot-pounds of energy. However, when we get to the 500-yard line, we're going to see not a considerable, but an amount more drop. 11.2 MOA.
Okay.
Identical wind values. And I think the 325 is coming to the table with a higher muzzle velocity, and that's helping with the wind deflection. It's a slippery bullet, too. 200 grain AccuBond's got a decent BC on it.
200 versus 225, right?
Sure. I would expect the 325 WSM to kind of kick it in the tail, so to speak. But the 338 RCM, no slouch. When we go to the 338 Win Mag, which is exactly that cartridge that the 325 was trying to beat out, and we're going to be shooting a 225 grain AccuBond with a muzzle velocity of 2750. Interestingly enough, emulating the muzzle energy, we find the 338 RCM does just that within a foot-pound. The AccuBond's higher BC than the projectile that the RCM was launching gives us an advantage in the drop at 10.6 MOA, windage advantage as well, 3.7 MOA. 325 WSM, it's still beating it in drop. Not in drift, but it's a close shave, man.
Okay.
It's a close shave.
But it's doing it with a bolt that's 25 grains less.
I didn't do an apples-to-apples comparison because I didn't have a factory-loaded option to necessarily make that apples-to-apples comparison. I can also say, like, as a hand loader, you can get these cartridges, all aforementioned, to do things that they're not doing on the paper expressed here, right? Like my 338-06. 210 grain Barnes TTSX, 2750, 11.1 at 500 yards, 4.2 wind. I'm pretty much identical to the 338 RCM in performance out of a 30-06 case, right? Just necked up to 33. So that's why I threw that little rascal in there. But the cartridge does exactly what they were looking for it to do. It is contending extremely well with the 338's performance in a completely different gun, completely different case. We're skipping the belt. We've got a more modern case design. We've talked ad nauseum about the WSM and all the attributes to its case design that make it such a delightful cartridge series. It's just this one is it just didn't make it.
You're right. When I got my 300 WSM, 2004, it was, so that would have been the year before this thing came out.
Yeah.
I'd just gotten it. And I was like, oh my gosh, now they have a 325.
You did feel a little bit of that, oh shoot moment?
Right.
Oh.
But it was just because, like, typical 300, 325, that's more. I need more, right? Still think I made the right choice. And to express that, I brought a couple loadings here, Ryan. And I guess not to, although in my mind it does, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like validate the 300 WSM. But also, like, more so, I'm just like, I don't see
merit.
The place, like, I guess I don't know a lot of cartridges. You could argue that, why do you need cartridge A? Because you have the 30-06, for goodness sakes, right? But so this is the, so a lot of people talk about the 325 and they say, well, you can shoot these bigger bullets in it, right?
That's true.
It's kind of optimized for that 200 grain. But I think that's just because, and I was reading some of this too, but that's what it's offered in as well. I mean, you could shoot a 180 in it,
yep,
or you could shoot a 200, where I think at the time when it was introduced, like, you weren't going to find 200 grain loadings for like a 300 WSM.
No.
You do now, though.
That's correct.
So I've got a couple here. I've got the 300 WSM with the 200 grain ELDX, right? And it's saying muzzle velocity of 2820. And what do you got over there?
2950.
So
less, but not significantly less.
Yes.
But that 200 grain ELDX, that's bringing a ballistic coefficient of bonkers proportion to the table.
It is.
And I'm not a crazy big BC guy, but if we're going to argue the drop and drift values, that's where that's absolutely going to smoke it.
It's saying, what's your drops are in
minutes of angle.
In MOA over there, yeah. I've got inches here, so.
What do you got?
40.8 at 500.
Okay. Well, I can't do that math, but
You could ask your phone. Say, hey, phone.
Right.
Regardless, so I feel like it's close.
It's a flat. The loading that you're describing is going to be a flatter shooting cartridge over distance, because we do have that higher BC value.
Right.
We're going to be able to retain a lot of that.
Probably tells me the BC in here somewhere. A G1 of 597.
Bonkers.
Yeah.
This 200 grain AccuBond's bringing 0.450 to the table.
Okay. A Nosler loading.
Yep.
In the 300 WSM. This is a 190 grainer, so 10 grains less, but you got a muzzle velocity of 2875. And I think this thing's pretty slippery too.
Very.
I thought that would have printed out the BC on there. My printouts are failing me, Ryan.
It's okay.
Regardless.
I think what you're getting at, though, is like, what problem is this cartridge solving?
Yes.
In these days, I don't think much. Simply because, and we're seeing this more and more with cartridge evolution and with projectile evolution, and it shouldn't come as a shock to us. When you look at the ELDX, for instance, in that 200 grain projectile, or the 190 grain ABLR that you have out here, these bullets are remarkably better than the bullets of 20 years ago in both performance values, like ballistic coefficient, and then also like a terminal standpoint, what that bullet is bringing to the table from either, retained mass at high impact velocities, or the ability to work at low impact velocities, like at long ranges.
Okay.
So when we're looking at an ELDX or an ABLR, these bullets are spectacularly optimized to function properly at those longer distances. If we're bringing a big BC value to the table and our launch velocity is very high, just tickling 2,900 feet per second with both of these loadings, we are absolutely surpassing most of the performance that 325 is going to give us, and then exceeding it handily. I'm not saying it nullifies the cartridge, because there's something like having a larger frontal area on a projectile does have a terminal advantage, but having a higher sectional density also has a distinct terminal advantage, and having a higher BC will help carry that distinct terminal advantage over a longer, distance, and then it fights wind better. And I think all of that goes into why the 325 rapidly fell off in popularity.
Now, these two, options that I just mentioned and we talked through, like, that's and we do that a lot, but that's looking through the lens of now.
Yeah.
When the 325 was introduced, like, these did not exist.
Correct.
Right. They weren't around. Right. So
your quote, big bore, medium bore, whatever you want to call it, options at the time were, and like very valid ones. Like, I have a 338.6. It was a factory rifle from the same era or vintage, extremely obscure cartridge.
I hadn't heard about it when you're like, I got a 338.6.
Yep.
I'm like, huh?
Yep. Factory rifle. It was a Weatherby Mark V, super big game master. Very limited production. Valiant attempt. The world wasn't ready. But your options at the time were like, I'm going to say 338 Federal. Was that even out then? I'd have to look back at the dates. Let's just say
338 Federal. It's in a similar time frame as this, though, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'll say 338 Win Mag. Okay, storied history, phenomenal cartridge. 340 Weatherby, very niche cartridge. Kind of it's an expensive gun. It's an expensive round. It has hellacious recoil. You had the Lazzaronis, so they're extremely obscure, and you had the Dakotas, like a 330 Dakota. Outside of that, anything that would land in that realm would be a bit odd. We can make an argument for a 35 Whelen too, of course. But at the time, that was a spectacularly viable, we'll call it a medium bore solution. And it did exactly, I think, what Winchester was looking to do.
I'd also say at the time, you look at how people are thinking about cartridges. I mean, I would say 2005. I mean, would you say that is right at the start of kind of this long range?
Yeah, I forgot to mention the rums too. And yes, I think absolutely it was.
People just, rangefinders weren't even close to what they are today.
Yep.
Ballistic calculators, I don't think were a thing.
Slide rules. Dope charts.
Don't quote me on the advent of the first ballistic calculator that would put smartphones and we just have a lot more stuff now.
I compiled this data on my couch yesterday while watching birds eat at my bird feeder. So
it's hard to I guess, it's like you're evaluating the merit of the cartridge, from
the eyes of somebody who has the convenience of
yes.
Yeah. And at the time, like I said, I think that they hit a home run. It just didn't hook up because in short order, and it probably hooked up for a short bit. I still every year get a lot of inquiry from people, especially from like British Columbia and Alaska.
Sure.
Asking about, how does a 325 short mag contend with my deadhold BDC reticle? Or, what rings, scopes, et cetera, do we recommend for a 325 short mag? But it's like last bastions of that, right? So they're just kind of the last holdouts in there. And I think it probably had a short burst of popularity and then quickly faded. Because at that same time, like all the things you mentioned, all of a sudden we start getting into more and more advanced cartridge technology, ballistics computing technology, range finding technology, and then cartridges like the 300 rum came out, 338 rum came out, and like as a direct answer to this small short cartridge, here's the biggest physical thing that we can put in the space available, right?
Right.
With the rums, which I think is just, we're talking about passive aggressive. Nice. Well,
that's just aggressive.
Yeah. Here's all the space you have. Here's this giant cartridge.
That's efficiency.
Yeah, sure. That's one way to look at it. I think that it was eclipsed by performance values of the modern era.
Yeah.
And, I'm not saying that that bore diameter, be it an 8mm, which is weird in itself, and we've never observed an 8mm in the U.S. really click. Like 8mm Remington Magnum, cult following behind it, didn't click. Crazy horsepower cartridge, rivaling the 340 Weatherby handily.
Yeah, what the? In some of my printouts, I was highlighting some of the 8mm Rem Mag.
Yep.
That's a big boy.
It is. Big case, big belt, big bullet.
Yeah, what's the parent case is the...
Well, you can look at it like full-size H&H or 416 Rem Mag or...
I think that's what they said, 416.
Correct.
Yeah.
So big belted case.
And the WSM is the 404 Jeffrey?
Correct. Yeah. Yep. Which is also an old case.
A shortened.
Yeah, shortened, big, wide, beltless feature, modern case, but very old roots. So, yeah, I mean, I don't get a lot of calls anymore about 338s in general with some of these new 30s that have come out, like 300 PRC or 300 Norma, 30 Nosler, things like that. A 30 caliber solution is often a really, really good solution, especially when we look at the bullets that we have nowadays. And it does not help the case of the 325. It does not allow it to crawl from the crypt and like get back on scene, which is a shame because it is a fine cartridge. Even more interesting to me is upon the release of the 325 WSM, and this was kind of into the infancy of the internet, for me anyways as a user, immediately people started wildcatting it. And they were making a 338 325 or the 338 300, where guys and gals were just taking the WSM case, whichever one they picked, and blown it out to 338 diameter and enjoying remarkable success to it. And so I look at that and I'm like, well, why couldn't the ballisticians and engineers at Winchester do it? And I'm sure they had very specific reasons for not, right? Whether it was cartridge overall length, exceeding meg length capacity, or whatever, feeding. A lot of talk out there about WSM.
I'm sure they looked into it.
Yeah, right. A lot of talk about WSM-based 338 Wildcats. And they seem to be doing great things, but they're not hooking up from a popularity standpoint. And I think a part of that, too, is like to reap the benefit of what the 338 bore has to offer, 250 grains to 300 grains. Now we're really talking about where that bore diameter comes into its own, at least from the convention of a lot of modern shooters, or the thought process of a lot of modern shooters, where we want a huge BC advantage over anything in its weight class or even near its weight class. We need a large velocity swing too. And this is why 338 Lapua, I'll say 340 Weatherby, but it often doesn't get looked at in terms of long range because you kind of have to hand load it to make it that way, because it just don't come with the bullets that you see like a 338 Lapua come with, 33 Nosler, or any of the other 33 caliber Wildcats that are hot on scene right now. You really got to step them up in order to appreciate what launching a 250, 285 grain or 300 grain high BC projectile offers. And the WSM is never going to do that. It just doesn't have the case. It doesn't have the space, which is a shame.
Well, and you exactly, and you talked about case and space, and when the 338 WSM, that never happened, because it just wasn't either meeting or exceeding the standard 338. From the sounds of it, a lot of that was because those bigger bullets would eat up.
Yeah, case and space
in the powder column, and then off you go.
And it's speculation at best, but had that thing had a .338 number hung on the front of it, would it have done better? A big part of me says probably, but then why didn't the RCM do better? Why don't I see 338 RCMs? Because this is a brilliant cartridge. Why don't I see either of these with any degree more frequency than I do a 300 Win Mag or a 300 Short Mag or even a 300 SOM?
Right. And we talked about the 338 on the podcast before, and I'm not sure how okay, if I was going to get a 33, I think I would likely get a 338, but I'm probably still not going to get a 338.
No, it's a lot of gun that's not giving you a massive advantage over, until you get into the 250 class projectile, my opinion, over what your WSM can do with the right bullet.
Right.
Right. And then you have to contend with recoil. Which is that's a whole nother talking point. Like why I think a lot of these cartridges aren't in vogue right now is because they beat the tar out of you when you shoot them, and they're expensive to shoot and they're hard to shoot well. And I think that's super, super valuable when you look at like holistically what makes good cartridges. How does it shoot?
Right.
And how does it shoot you? I've toiled
philosophically.
Right. I've toiled over much the same. I have a 338. I have a 338.6. It's a very uncomfortable gun to shoot. It's a 5 3/4 pound rifle without a scope on it. It weighs just barely 7 pounds.
You always threaten to take it hunting. Have you taken it hunting yet?
Have not, but I've worked. I've worked up loads for it. It shoots fabulously. So it has a scope. I have loads done and developed. I have 338.6 head stamped brass, factory stuff.
Oh.
Very exciting.
It's cute.
It is. And I will take it hunting. I just need to. It's a bugaboo to shoot, though. It's not great.
Yeah, maybe you should book a brown bear hunt and have a reason to go hunt.
Probably can't afford that. Mostly by probably, I mean not at all.
Just figure it out later. Take out a loan or something.
It's a write-off.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a great Seinfeld episode. Seinfeld was hot at the time that this cartridge came out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, big time.
But all that being said, 325 WSM, it's got a lot going for it, but I think it's got a lot going against it.
The only reason it has anything going against it, and you could probably say this for just about any cartridge, is because what's around it.
Yeah,
because it's a fine do-all cartridge.
Sure. There are better solutions.
There are, but I can see why anybody who ever bought a 325 WSM is like, how is this not more popular?
Sure.
I love this thing. It's killed everything I've shot with it handily, and yet, wah, wah.
I think sometimes when we see that caliber, it inspires a bit more confidence, perhaps. I'd be curious to know if we just simply swapped the barrels and got them into a 300, would they feel somehow less effective, confident in themselves, knowing that with advancements in modern ballistic technology, namely bullet construction, shape, and capabilities, they probably would be at an advantage over their 300 or 325, running the 300. Would they feel something in here? And I think yes, I do.
I think mentally you'd feel like, oh man, I took a step down. Like, I've had such, raving success, which is hard to get by that. And I get it. The, your personal experience with like, no, I know this works. Now I'm, essentially taking a step back. Is this going to work, as good? Even though on paper it looks like it should handily kind of spank it. Because you're like, no, 325.
Yeah. No, I'm there. I do that all the time. Hey, look,
do you think even just simply just the way it rolls off with what's available, you're like, oh, I can get a 300, this or that, or I can get a 338 and then a 325. Like in some ways you're like, oh, it's right in the middle. It's a sweet spot. But then in other ways it's a no man's land.
Correct. I think it's why a lot of quarter bores don't do this as good. I think that's why 25 anything, a lot of people are like, well, it's not. It's a little bit more than a 6, but it ain't a 6.5.
Right.
Which is a shame because
we like to round up.
Yeah, we do. Well, yeah, we do. That and I think metric. They did their best to make it.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
That's not an 8mm.
Yeah, it is though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is 325. This has nothing to do with the 8mm.
Yeah, and it's not a 325 either. It's a 323.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I think they did their best to disguise it as a standard cartridge.
Where does the 5 come from then?
I think, when you're naming a cartridge, you just kind of do whatever you want. Why not? What's a 30?
Let's have some fun with it.
Yeah, what's a 32 ACP? That's not a 32.
This stuff always just
boggles the mind.
Yes.
Yeah. It's still a fine cartridge. I just think it's one later in a couple of decades maybe. Somebody's going to put on a pair of like round frame glass. Be like, my goodness gracious, a 325. I didn't think any of them made it. or like 1,000 years from now, some Attenborough type is going to be talking about it.
I haven't looked in a long time, but I've even been offered. Because people know like, oh, you like WSMs,
Yeah.
You want to buy this 325?
Yeah, they're trying to appeal to you a little bit there
and
round your collection out.
Right. And very, which I guess that's a logical line of thinking.
Sure.
And the couple times, honestly, the rifle they would have sold it to me for a song.
Yep. I've seen a lot of those rifles sold for a song.
So if you're looking for a good deal on a cartridge that'll knock down anything you want to point it at,
oh yeah,
you might be able to find one in the 325.
Yep. And probably hasn't been shot much.
No.
Because there's not a lot of ammo out there. It's still a handful to shoot. That's still a 200 grain projectile going just about $3,000. That's, yeah.
Yeah.
There's only
Which I'm for it.
Yeah. Oh, no, I agree. It checks a lot of boxes. It's just the boxes for some are, you can't reconcile them. Still an 8mm. At the end of the day, man, it's still an 8mm.
So you'd think by today's line of thinking in, the U.S., North America, the millimeters, very strong, I feel.
The right millimeters are.
Yeah, but they didn't call it an 8mm, but a millimeter cartridge too early. Like, I feel like if you were a millimeter, other than the 7 Rim Mag,
yeah,
which is like the only one that's historically been something in these parts, right?
It's been something. I'm just alluding to my...
Yeah, I know. You're riling folks up again.
Oops.
Anyway, I feel like if you're a new 6mm Creed or whatever, that's cool.
Yeah.
Which that is a cool cartridge, actually. But like if you're an old, then you're not cool.
No.
Old guard millimeter cartridge is not cool.
Yeah. But it is a fine cartridge.
It's fantastic.
It's just...
But it is, Ryan.
Yeah.
Unequivocally a...
Lead balloon.
Lead balloon.
No question about it, Mark.
Poor thing.
I know it, right? And it's a handsome cartridge. When you look at it, you're like, that's a handsome cartridge. It has all the things I like. It's proportional. It looks good. Its bullet diameter isn't too small for its voluminous case, nor is it too large. It's right at about the sweet spot, almost the sweet spot.
It's almost at the sweet spot. I mean, yeah, I agree. You look at it, you go, well, that's hot.
Oh, yeah, that's another thing. We usually have cartridges here to talk about. I just want you to imagine.
Yes, imagine, if you will.
A really nicely shaped cartridge in the middle of the case, or table here. Case, WSM-ish proportions. Bullet, slightly larger in diameter. But it's so obscure these days that unless you're hand loading ammunition or you've got a line on a pile of it, somebody maybe bought a case in their basement, it's hard to come by. I don't even have a single fired cartridge.
I was talking to MC Ryan about this. We're gonna try and find one.
I hope so. I don't know anybody here who's got one.
I don't know.
I don't have any. In
Might have to
my vast
call a ammo store or something.
It's gonna open some
one up.
museum vault, and the tour guide will talk about it, and then you can have it on loan for a picture.
Yeah.
We tried, folks. We tried to give you a
right?
medium bore short mag, but that balloon did not sail.
It didn't. Now, I will say this. Maybe this might be foreshadowing of a future lead balloon. Might not. We'll see where this series goes. Let us know. In my researching, and I came down and talked to you about it. I was looking at the 325 WSM, it kind of naturally, looking at all the WSMs. The 7 WSM. Now, that seems like it should have been something.
Should have. But it wouldn't.
But it wasn't.
No. Of the two that made it most unscathed, and really only one, the 270 and the 300. And the 270, I think, is finally just peacefully and quietly died.
Mm-hmm.
And the 300 still strong. Phenomenal cartridge. The 270 the 6.8 came out. I just want you to think of the Office when Pam's like, it's the same picture.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same picture. 6.8 Western, a.k.a. 270 WSM, slightly.
It's better.
Yeah, well, yeah. The 7,
it's better.
That 7 WSM also didn't make it.
It didn't.
No.
But I was looking at the numbers that they were attaching to it. I was like, well, that looks like all the things I like.
It does.
And then now you have the 7 PRC.
Yep.
Which is we talked about that one, and
yeah.
I think it is an extremely fine cartridge.
Yes.
But then I was looking, well, what the heck is... I don't know. I need to do some more comparing.
Yep. The undoing of many of these smaller cases that have like a large volume but are short, with the expressed intent of being paired to a certain action length, is what happens when you put high BC slippery profile projectile bullets in them. It eats your case capacity up, and you kind of neuter them or mute them with respect of what they can obtain from velocity or obtain from velocity numbers by seeing that bullet so deep in there.
Yeah.
You just sneak that little rascal out a little bit, and my gosh, is it amazing. But it's not what it's here for.
I think you're onto something.
Well.
All right, everybody. Well, there you have it. The 325 WSM. We covered it.
Yep. You
asked for it a lot. And, there you go. There's your...
That's sad.
Sad.
Oh.
If you're watching on YouTube, we have a very anemic helium balloon that's not doing any heliuming. It is.
That's a shame.
There she is. She's on the ground.
First
well
lead balloon, Mark.
This was it.
860 days of me pleading every podcast meeting. Hey, I've got this.
Was it everything you dreamt of?
It was exactly what I wanted. 10 likes and we'll continue lead balloons.
10 likes. That's the key number.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, guys. 325 WSM. Do you have one? Do you love it? Do you hate us for not loving it? Even though we don't not love it, we just don't.
Have you put the smack down on an elk, mule deer, brown bear, black bear, whitetail, pronghorn?
With authority, likely.
Yep. And do you feel that this cartridge's failure is unjust?
Yes. And maybe this podcast will, I'd like to think, maybe it'll rekindle it a little bit, perhaps. I
hope so, too. I hope so, too.
So, if you have a 325 WSM and love it, we definitely understand why.
Yep.
It's just one of those things.
Yep. It's an 8mm.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Take care. We'll see you on the next one.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.